Let's start the show off a little differently with our guest here. Normally we have McShay chiming in, but we have Danny Kanell with us also. And, I remember one time after a breakup seeing the other person out to dinner very soon after the breakup, and everybody that was with me was like, oh, shit. That's a bit how I feel with Danny today after the selection committee leaves out Florida State. So let's just kind of let's see where we're at right now. How are we a day removed from massive disappointment, Danny?
Well, I hope we're all friends after today, because I don't know how this is going to go. Been kind of just hunkered down. We're
here for therapy, Danny.
Okay, good.
This is therapy for you. Yeah.
Okay, good. Todd, it's great to see you. It's been a minute.
Great to see you.
So I thought it would actually it would get better. They say time heals all wounds. After watching more analysis and more takes, I think I'm even more irritated. But it does boil down to this, though. We've had this debate for years, you and I, Ryan. We've had arguments, we've yelled at each other. And I think I've always held true. I've always felt for that team, whoever it was, that gets left out, that I just felt bad for the players. The coaches would be fine. It's the players. Because when they get to campus, wherever it is, and this time it's Tallahassee, they're told at the beginning of the season, if you do this, this, and this, you can win a national championship. And, for the first time, we've seen it where they did this, this, and this, and they got left out. I just think it sucks for them. And to see Jordan Travis, apologizing, it's irritating. It's frustrating, but there's nothing we can do about it now.
It does suck, right? I mean, as anyone who's competed, especially in a team sport, and put in everything that is required to get to where Florida State got, if you don't feel for those players, then something's wrong with you. Okay. I guess and I mentioned therapy. I guess if we were to sit down on a couch and just have you lay down and talk things out, the hard part for me is this. We've all played on teams. We all know that every single player in that Florida State locker room deserves to be just gutted, miserable, feel betrayed, right? All of those things. There's no question. But then there's the big picture, big business of college football. And looking at it from an outsider's perspective, and I'm wondering maybe if you could look at it if USC was in this situation, right? Where they do the same exact thing. They have the same exact kind of team. They run the table. They do everything required, but it's a Pac-12 team. It's not Florida State. And all of a sudden, Caleb Williams gets injured. And we're looking at it from the outside in and saying, that's not the same team, though, that we're talking about in the college football playoff. And as just a college football fan, I want to see the four best teams right now. And I'm not sure that Florida State, with a backup quarterback, with Rodemaker in there, is one of the best four teams. I guess that's the hard part. Just talking to you, understanding the pain. How do you feel if you try to remove yourself from Florida State? Can you see that?
Do you think we have the four best teams?
That Florida State's one of the four best teams?
No. The current status with Michigan, Washington, Texas, Bama, are those the four best teams?
I honestly, if you were just asking me the four best teams right now, given what they have, I would say Michigan, Texas, Alabama, Georgia.
Right.
But I understand why Washington is in there.
Why not Ohio State?
All season long, I thought that they were a notch below where they've been in years past.
So did I, but power rankings-wise, point spread-wise, all the things that have been used against Florida State would tell you that the four best teams aren't Washington and they're not Texas. That's where I would just point that out. This has always concerned me. And then it's kind of here we are talking about Florida State being this team, because you could feel this. If it was a Pac-12 undefeated champ, that Ryan and I, that's where we had some of our biggest arguments. And thankfully it worked out where we could still be friends, because remember in 2015 Iowa, it was disgusting. It was gross, but they kept winning. And Ryan and I used to get into shouting matches over should they get in. And eventually they came a half yard short. Michigan State got in. And so it kind of resolved itself. I would rather be sitting here and Florida State lost that game, lost it gross, looked ugly. And then it's put to bed. It's hey, there's no debate whether they're deserving, whether they're the best. It's just have it take care of itself. It didn't. And so now it just feels how can you say, I think it's incredibly arrogant, not from Utah, but from anyone who says I know who the best 4 teams are.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever metric, whether you watched them on tape, whether you watched them play in the SEC or Pac-12 or Big Ten, whatever it was, I think it's incredibly arrogant because we've seen all the time. We're always wrong. I mean, Friday night, I thought Oregon was going to win by 2 touchdowns against Washington. They didn't. So like that's where I would push back and just say, and it's the system. I mean, Ryan, you probably got sick of me. Like you wanted to talk about some league pass game that was taking place, like on the NBA, as opposed to me going one more time in on the playoffs. But like I used to always rail against the system and how messed up it is.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I feel like my issue with it always becomes, okay, now we have this system, and then all anyone's ever going to do is tell us how wrong it is the whole time. And that's just the history of college football. And I certainly don't like the new version of this because everything that just happened in the last 2 weeks won't matter. All of these teams will be in. And, I don't like that everybody gets in the NFL now. I don't like that more than half the teams in the NBA get in. I just think that playing for a national championship of college football, back to the Iowa arguments that we used to have all the time, which again, wasn't you being pro Iowa, it was just anybody that wasn't in the SEC. And that's why you did it. So I feel like if you have a chance to play for a championship, you at least have to do one thing that year that proves that you're worthy of it. And these arguments that we're going to have 11, 12, 13, and 14, there's going to be a couple of those teams that haven't done anything. And that's where I sympathize with Florida State because you beat LSU, you beat Florida, you beat 2 SEC teams in your non-conference on top of winning a Power 5. And that part of it sucks. But I think there was 2 problems. It was the quarterback, almost like an NCAA tournament seeding thing where if a player goes down and then the committee seeds you lower. But again, you'd still get to be in the tournament as opposed to what's happening here. And the Texas-Bama thing really screws you because there was no way they could put Bama in and leave Texas out. So you fell into what I felt like, one of my biggest storm. Right. Yep. One of the biggest issues, my complaints about all of this stuff, like I'd rather Florida State be in. I'm okay with Bama being in. I know that's not what you'd want for me on television. You'd want me to be super adamant about it one way or the other. I can kind of see where they came up with it. I think the problem I have is when it turns into conspiracy theories and anti-Florida State stuff, and that there's massive, like these dark figures at work making sure that this wouldn't happen. And I've seen some of the stuff play out, and a lot of it's like some media stuff from Florida State, which reminds me of like Florida State Twitter when it was on fire there for about 2 straight years, where it feels like that fan base in particular, now they're going to have more ammunition than ever before. That feels like just the world is out to get them. And I'd have to ask, like, okay, take me through that conversation. Take me through the part where the television networks and the other commissioners are getting together being like, hey, let's make sure we have a good playoff, but our number one priority is screwing over Florida State. It feels that way. I just don't think that's true.
Do you remember the question I asked you last time I was on? A few weeks ago?
Yeah, you said, is there a real anti-Florida State bias?
So I don't know if it's necessarily geared toward Florida State. I think clearly, maybe it's not an anti-Florida State bias, but I absolutely think there's an anti-ACC bias. That's a down conference. And there was a concerted effort, unlike anything we've seen in the playoff era for 10 years. And I think it's because the power players and the biggest voices in the game saw this potentially happening. When you see, Herb Street going on Pardon My Take and pounding the table and saying, it's never been about the deserving, it's been about the best. Like, all of a sudden, he's speaking like those committee members are listening. When you see Sankey going on game day before and saying, hey, it's like Sesame Street, one of these is not like the other, not one person pushed back and said, oh, really? Well, you're right, not one of these things are like the other. One of these has the worst non-conference record versus other Power Fives, and it's your conference. Like, that's what's crazy to me is that the SEC gets this pass and they get in. Like, that ultimately was they weren't going to leave the SEC out. Like that, I think there's a fear of Nick Saban. I think there's a fear of Greg Sankey. Like, what would happen? Those consequences, what would they be if we left out the SEC? And so you saw that kind of that conversation starting. And I think that wears on the committee. I think they're like, yeah, you know what? It is the SEC. Because do you remember in September? Like, I remember Feinbaum saying, woof, what a rough month for the SEC. They lost all those marquee games. Texas, and that's at the time we thought Texas A&M was going to be good. They got waxed by Miami. Florida State beats LSU. And those were and Alabama loses to Texas. Like, those were the 3 marquee games, and they lost all of them. Something they never have done. Those arguments have been thrown in my face for 10 years, And there's nothing you can say back. You're right. You got to win those non-con games. So then when they don't, they still get the edge. I think that's when it kind of, you see like the power dynamic that comes into play.
Right. But like, what is it? 10-9 versus 7-9. Do you think those numbers are so definitive that the ACC is the better conference than the SEC?
So it's 9-7 and 7-9, right? They're flip-flopped.
Yeah, whatever it is, it's like a hand.
So
like,
look,
I'm with you that the SEC is down a little, but you're doing what you did like during that bowl season where it was like Kanell season, where it was that 1 year where the SEC bowls just sucked. Right. And then it was like, see, I told you this conference was totally overrated. And you're like, I really think it has to do with like, for me, look, my definition of like who the best conference is, and clearly the SEC was down this year. It was. Right. But it's still, to me, I just don't think it's worse than the ACC, despite the non-conference stuff. So I think we agree up to a point where look, again, it's my definition. It's different than your definition, clearly, because we've had this argument before. But for the belt to be handed over to another conference, it would take a little while. Like there would be a cycle where I'd think, wait, that other conference, fill in the blank, has 3 or 4 teams that I think can win a national championship, which is what's been kind of the foundation of this SEC run for 15 years.
How are you ever supposed to take away that mantle if you don't even get credit for 1 year? I hear you, like, but
maybe it's part of it. Maybe we're in phase one.
Right. So I never said the ACC was the strongest conference, and I've never said like it's always. And again, these arguments, I think you're like, oh, so tired of them. Like, yeah, the SEC is good, but how big is that gap? Like, is it worthy of saying, you know what, you guys are just not going to get a seat, and this one's going to get a seat every single time, even if they're maybe not deserving, and a lot of times it's 2 seats.
But the SEC, I mean, every year we've seen the SEC is producing, most years a national champion. And I think the thing too that gets lost, and you do the strength of record and all of that, but the SEC, like Kentucky smoked Louisville, and Kentucky's not a very good SEC. If you want to start doing all these comparisons,
I don't know, Todd. I think you're going to lose this one because, I mean, there's just too many. You're right about the Kentucky one.
Yeah, no, but I'm not even saying
this is a bad year for the SEC with this stuff. I mean, Florida goes out to Utah, gets their asses kicked. LSU,
I understand that, but my bigger point is there's more depth and quality week in and week out in what you have to endure, I believe, in the SEC than you do in the ACC. It's a lot. And even if you're winning games, there's still wear and tear, and there's still the environment you're playing in. And I'm not here to start this SEC versus the world kind of thing, but it's hard. It would be like, I would be uncomfortable with a college football playoff, group of 4, whatever we have, however you want to phrase it, that didn't include an SEC team in it. And I know it's about this year. I get it. But history has shown that the SEC is going to more than compete, and the SEC is the hardest conference to come out of every single year.
We could have that debate for hours, but I don't want to do that because I think it's just a cyclical, downhill.
Right,
but what I'll say is this: I don't think it gets better with 12 teams, and that's like my goal is I wish people would pay attention because everyone's like, we got 1 more year, we'll just get 12 teams. Where they're still going to get more, and like. Of course. So then you're going to get more national champions if you get more teams that get a crack at it, right? They've had half the field when there's 2 out of 4 getting that opportunity multiple times. They're going to get 4 out of the 12 at least, most years. So I would hope they would have a champion eventually come from that aspect. I just wish, and maybe I don't even know how to do it, but how do we get people out of it? And maybe it is just saying, hey, here's how you bring your 4 to the table. Here's how you bring your 4 to the table. ACC, Big 10, you guys get 2, or Big 12, you guys get 2 each, and there's our 12-team field. Like, at least you would know going in, because I do think this was written so that you could control who was going to be in. And we saw that in the most obvious way possible by keeping Florida State out. Because in the end, is it about the 4 best or is it about the 4 most entertaining matchups? And I do think it could have been gross. Like, if Florida State was playing and it was Brock Glenn and they performed that way offensively, that would be one of the uglier games we've seen. But I don't think you can go in and pull the strings like that to try to ensure that doesn't happen, because how do we know Florida State's defense doesn't shut down any of those other teams the way they did Louisville? Because Louisville's a pretty good offense.
Look, I was really impressed with their defense against them. I thought Louisville was going to put some points up and it was going to be a bit more of a shootout after what we'd seen. So, that's the part of it that also sucks too. is like Florida State wasn't going to get nearly enough credit for a great defensive performance because they were going to look at the quarterback drop off and go, oh, they barely scored any points. And look, the pick in the end zone, the way the game was playing out, like there were just things you knew somebody in the room, if they wanted to talk down Florida State, they were going to have these opportunities. But when you talk about deserving and where the committee is at, would you say the 2 losses last year for Bama was too much for them to break their preferences, to break their rules, and putting TCU and Ohio State in over them last year?
Well, they already had Georgia. They already had one. And trust me,
Right.
I bet it was a pretty significant debate between Alabama. Like, I mean, if you just went off who were the 4 best teams, you'd have Alabama and Georgia in it every year. Same with Michigan and Ohio State, because they are. They have the more talent. They have the most talent in the country. But you had Georgia, so you didn't have to leave them out. And then like the TCU thing, that's the irony in this. Everybody's like, well, look at what happened last year with TCU. They shouldn't have been in there. They beat Michigan along the way, who everybody thought they were a touchdown favorite. Like, so that just kind of goes to show you this whole thing is a flawed process by trying to guess who the 4 best teams are. Like, you can't use TCU. I know it was ugly and they got absolutely demolished, but they still beat Michigan. And I do think with a 12 team, you'll eliminate that type of final from happening because you'll get exposed along the way.
Yeah, it's just kind of hard because the person who's telling the other person they're wrong is essentially using like an argument that only works against the other person. You know what I mean? Like if you just keep saying, well, how do you know? How do you know? It's like, well, at some point, someone has to write 4 names down, right? At some point, they have to feel good about it. It reminds me a lot of like when I do the NBA voting now. When I fill out my ballot, it's a real ballot and I have a real vote and I'm thinking about all the different options, especially in the defensive teams. It's like when you hand this in, it's not going to be perfect. You want it to be perfect. You put time into it, but there's going to be a couple things you write down here where you could even poke holes in the argument that you're making. And ultimately, that's what we have with this committee. Because when we had computers, people didn't love that. They were like, what is this? And be like, call Brad Edwards again, and when people propose this TV show, I try to remind people every year, it's like they really do reset it. I mean, you could argue that Georgia shouldn't have dropped nearly as much as they dropped, but like, What are they going to do? Put 2 of them in from a down SEC year after they already know they're kind of screwing over Florida State? So that wasn't going to happen. Whatever the result is, it's rare if you go through the 10 years of this that you feel like, okay, I can't poke a hole in it. And that's, ultimately where, even though I feel bad for Florida State, if I were in the room, I probably would have voted for Florida State over Bama and felt ridiculous about leaving the SEC out. But if Florida State's going to beat 2 SEC schools, this was not a Power 5 school that went 13-0 and played in Iowa in the conference championship game, which is its own joke. But, 3 directionals in the 9th game in conference against Rutgers. Well, Rutgers is actually okay this year, but you understand my point. Yeah. Like the fact that Florida State got to 13-0 with those 2 non-conference and a worthy opponent in Louisville, I feel bad for them, but I'm not outraged, I guess.
Right. But like, again, there's just so many things that kind of expose the flaws in anyone's theory. Like if Florida State's that bad, why are they still getting to play Georgia? Like, and they're 14 touchdown underdog. Like they don't deserve in a New Year's 6. Like if they're that bad, keep them like they're not that good.
Well, that wasn't going to happen. That wasn't going to happen.
I know. And the biggest winner in all this is Michigan because they get the 1 seed. Washington's the team that's getting screwed too. They had a better resume with more quality wins in a conference, which I think we can all agree is way deeper than the Big Ten. Michigan cheats their balls off to get to this point over the past 3 years, and they just waltz in as the number 1 seed.
Let's go now.
Which is a big deal because now Washington has to travel across the country to go play in New Orleans. They should have been the 1 seed playing in their backyard with its home field advantage, which the 1 seed is supposed to get. There's a lot of things. Then you mentioned like the eye test stuff. Well, it was just a week ago that Bama's struggling with Auburn, and yet no one's bringing that up, how bad that game, how bad they looked with their starters. And you want to go back and say, well, Florida State didn't look great against Florida. They needed style points. They didn't look good against Louisville. Michigan looked awful offensively versus Iowa. Now, Iowa's a great defense, but you didn't hear 1 peep about, are they deserving? Are they worthy? Like, not a question about those performances. It's just, Florida State was held to a different standard. And I think it's, all of it was the perfect storm, like McShay said.
Well, thanks, Danny. We appreciate the time.
Good catching up, bud.
Yeah, you too. Carson Beck.
Beck.
Were you surprised Carson Beck? I think he lost some money, and possibly it's a good news situation for Georgia that he's coming back. Because if he was thinking about leaving, I think he comes back. Yeah.
I agree. I think he needs another year. I mean, the quarterbacks, if you can get another year, he needs another year. But I like what he's done and the way he's progressed.
He was awesome.
It certainly was. Yeah, he was a lot better midway, most of the second half of the season than he was in the beginning. I was worried in the beginning, to be honest.
So you know what you guys need to be rooting for?
What's that?
Bama wins it all. Florida State beats Georgia by more than a touchdown. And then guess what we have? Co-national champs. I mean, you'd have two common opponents because Florida State beat LSU.
Why don't we just get a stadium? We'll get a stadium. We'll get the TV powers to be.
Let's go.
Get them all together. If that happens, we'll just go play it on the field, right? I'm sure Nick would love to do that.
I'm sure.
If you don't think Kanell has like 6
for Saban. I mean, Saban's got so many raw deals. I'm just glad he finally got like another opportunity. He's just gotten shafted so many times.
It has to be extra bad that it's Bama. I mean, if it had been Texas, if it had been Washington, if it had been Ohio State, the fact that it was Bama, like you're doing better than I thought you'd be doing.
Yeah, I'm actually proud of you, man. You've
well, he could be a little different with us than he is on Twitter because I felt like
that is true.
Did you think, hey, I've got to get the message out? Like when you're sending out your Florida State propaganda, are you thinking like, okay, this will no, it is. I mean, it's all propaganda. I don't even mean that in a negative fashion. I mean, it's just you dropping pamphlets from a B2.
I don't have the platform that some of these dudes have on that are just throwing Florida State under the bus. So I'm trying to counterpunch. I'm trying to just put stuff out there. My goodness. So you got they're the mainstream media. They're the liberal media, dang it. And the conservative
like
Florida State crowd gets screwed. That's why I had to take to X. That's where the real
I know. He was doing
No one can shut me down on
chats.
X.
Not yet, at least.
All right, we'll keep fighting the good fight, man.
Appreciate you guys.
Talk to you later. Thanks, Danny.
See you, bud.
See ya.